Okay, this evening we're getting ready to start Acts chapter 27. We have only one more chapter after this evening, so Sunday we'll likely finish up the book of Acts. As I'd mentioned, we're going to jump into 1 Corinthians after this. We've studied the formation of the church. We've studied how the church functions, and now we see in 1 Corinthians particularly the effects of the world upon the church. And we see a church that was influenced by the world, and we see Paul correcting that church and bringing it back in line. And then we see in 2 Corinthians a continuation of that church turning back to following Christ as it should. We left off with Paul standing in front of King Agrippa, and he was trying to witness to King Agrippa, and King Agrippa realized that. And he said to Paul, do you think that such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? And then Paul, you see the heart of Paul here. He says, it doesn't matter how long, whether it's short or long, he says. I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. One thing I wanted to point out, I didn't mention last time, he says, all who are listening to me. Who is listening to is Paul today? We are, yeah. So Paul's words today are still being preached. The world is still listening to Paul. And Paul has the same wish today for everyone in the world as he had then. And that is they may become a Christian as he is. Of course, he wishes they don't have to go through all the persecution he did. But he's praying for their salvation. So then the king rose, and with him the governor and Bernice and those sitting with them. And then they left the room, and we talked a little bit about this last week, and they began talking amongst one another, and they still can't figure out why in the world they've got Paul held captive, because they like him, or why he's a prisoner. And they said, as they were speaking amongst themselves, they said, this man is not doing anything that deserves death or even imprisonment. Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. So Paul has appealed to Caesar. So since he's appealed to Caesar, he has now got to go present himself before Caesar, which is in Rome. So Paul has got to make a trip to Rome. The problem with it is Paul is on the Jerusalem, so to get, they went from Jerusalem up to, what's the town they're in? I forget the name of it off the top of my head. Anyway, it's on the coast. Caesarea, that's where it's. So they're in Caesarea. They've got to sail across the sea to get to Italy because there's no direct way to get there by land. So now they've got to set sail to get there. So in 27:1 it says, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. What does the word we tell us? Remember, this was written by the book of Luke. Luke wrote this book. Right, so Luke's with them. So there are several traveling with Paul as they get setting sail for Italy. And one of them is Luke, because he uses the word we. Luke was with Paul up to Acts 21:18, when Paul was probably put in prison. Luke had probably been living in Caesarea or close by, and now at the end of that time, Luke joins Paul again. This means that Luke was on a journey to Rome with Paul. So again, we've decided to set sail for Italy, and Paul was handed over to a centurion who belonged to the imperial regiment. So he's like a prison guard, was assigned to Paul. The imperial regiment was actually a special unit of the Roman army. They were similar to a special forces unit that we have today. They were responsible for spying, for transporting important political prisoners and personalities and things such as that. So they boarded a ship, and they boarded a ship from Adramyttium, and they were going to sail along the coast. So they're going to basically sail along the coast along the province of Asia and then put out to sea, because they've got to go across the sea to get to to Rome, to Italy. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. So he's now mentioned that Aristarchus is with them. Here's a map to kind of get a feel for where they're going from. They're all the way down there in Caesarea, and they're going to actually sail along the coast up to this place called Adramyttium. Eventually is where they're going to end up at. So they went from Jerusalem to Caesarea, and then they're going to end up in Adramyttium. Paul's voyage to Rome took about 6 months, and it was about a 2,000-mile travel that he made. That squiggly line, and we're going to get to where they get lost and everything, shows you the exact route he went. If you remember, Italy's shaped like a boot. Rome is where he's going to end up at in Italy. So he's leaving the coast and heading all the way up to Italy. So they're at that Adramyttium, and they boarded a ship about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of the sea again. And Aristarchus is with us. Paul was accompanied by 2 very close Christian friends on his trip to Rome, Luke and Aristarchus. It was unheard of for a prisoner to be allowed to have companions on a prison route to be tried at Rome. Historius tells us there could be only 2 possible ways that they could have included Paul's friends with him. Number 1, they would have had to take the position of slaves of Paul. Or 2, Festus, knowing the innocence of Paul and wanting to secure his good reputation with Rome, allowed Paul to take his companions with him so that Paul would speak highly of him when Paul arrived in Rome. I think it's probably more likely what's going on. He knows he's getting ready to talk to the big dog, and he wants to make sure he puts in a good word for him. So he's kind of doing him a favor here. So they're sailing along, and they said, the next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. So again, they've originally started in Jerusalem. They went to Sidon. So the next day we landed at Sidon, and again, what it shows you here is the relationship that Paul has again with his those that's holding prisoner. Obviously, they like him and they trust him because they're actually allowing him to go stay with his friends as they go along to these port areas. Because keep in mind, if a Roman lost a prisoner, a Roman guard, he paid the prisoner's sentence himself. So Julius must have liked Paul and trusted him to allow Paul to go ashore and meet with his friends. Now that term, provide for his needs, is translated from the Greek word epimeleus, which is a medical term. This likely indicates that Paul was sick and needed medical care also. So Paul might not have been feeling well. He might have been injured. We know they'd beaten him. So regardless, he was allowed to go leave the ship and have his friends take care of him while they were in that port. From there, we put out to sea again and passed the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So there's Sidon where they were at, and there's Cyprus. And the lee just means along the a sticking out point, a point sticking out from that island. They were running into some heavy winds. So it says, we then sailed across the open sea of the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia and landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. So again, they're now from Cyprus, that lee of Cyprus, up here to Myra is where they're at now. Now they're going to get on a much larger ship because before they were taking the smaller boat around the coast. Now they've got to actually go out into the ocean. So they're actually getting on a much larger ship to make this journey. It was likely a ship that was carrying grain and things such as that. It said, we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite of Salmone. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Haven, near the town of Lasea. So again, interesting thing, what I love about Scripture, you can find all these places. So they left here, and they went to this island of Crete, and they're at that Lasea, which you see down there kind of at the southern point of that island. So the problem is they were having difficulties. Back then they didn't have the ships that we have that have powered engines that could make them go. They were at the mercy of the wind. And they were having difficulties. They were sailing into the wind. The wind wasn't blowing the right direction. So it took them a lot longer than expected. And that's what Paul says next. He said, much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous, because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So they're getting close to the winter season. They're getting to a point when they really shouldn't be sailing. They shouldn't even be attempting the trip. Since Festus would have taken office in July, by the time he went to Jerusalem, came back, heard Paul, had Agrippa come down and figure out what to do with Paul, it was probably around mid-August when Paul first set sail. The Day of Atonement, which is Yom Kippur, occurs on the 10th day of the 7th month of the Jewish calendar, which is the month of Tishri. That falls in the Roman calendar at the end of September or beginning of October. From November 11th to the end of March, nobody crossed the Mediterranean. The winds were extremely strong, and the sea was too rough to cross. From September 14th to November 11th, the period between the summer sailing season and the winter close season was known as the treacherous or dangerous season. If you sailed during this time, you were taking a gamble. Paul knew this too, and so he tries to warn them because he knows the weather is unpredictable. He knows it's a bad time to leave. The problem with that, though, is if they wait, they're going to have to wait the whole winter there. They can't wait until. So that's going to put them way behind. But it says in verse 9, leading on, it says, so Paul warned them. He said, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, into our own lives also. So Paul's trying to warn them what's best if we stay here and wait this out. I know it's going to put us behind schedule, but we're in that very treacherous season leading up to getting ready to basically the season when nobody sails because it's too dangerous.
So that's basically hurricane season.
Exactly, that's another way to look at it. It's hurricane season. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot, of the owner of the ship. Well, look what do you think the pilot of the owner's ship is interested in? Money, right. If he's sitting in there in the port, he's not making no money. He's not going to get paid till he gets that cargo where it's supposed to be going. So he's anxious to get this going because he wants to make his money. And it continues, it says, since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. So again, that's kind of where Phoenix is where they're hopefully wanting to eventually get to be able to sail forward. So it says, when a gentle wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. So what happened was they were waiting there. They didn't want to wait the winter out because the owner of the ship felt like his ship wouldn't really do good there in the winter anyway, plus he's losing money. So they decided to make this trip. And they noticed a gentle south wind, which was the right direction. So they noticed, hey, the wind is blowing the right direction. It's not rough seas. It's a gentle wind. Let's go for it. So they saw their opportunity. So basically they took the anchor up and they sailed along the shore of Crete. However, we just mentioned it, hurricane season. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. So they were all the way down there at Lasea. They were thinking about sailing around to Phoenix, but they got into that. The wind was blowing the right direction, but then they got into this hurricane force wind, and it blows them completely off course. And at that point, they were at the mercy of the storm. It says, as we passed to the lee of a small island called Claudia, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. So there's the wind, there's Claudia, the little island there. So you can see that their original intent was to the Green Line. They were going to sail along the coast of Phoenix and then potentially winter there or sail on to, depending on how the weather was, sail on to Italy, to Rome. They never made it along the coast. They started along the coast, and that hurricane blew them off course. Now they're all the way down past Claudia, so they're completely lost. And the seas are getting rough because it says, so the men hoisted it aboard because they were having. Let me take a step back. They were having issues because they basically they couldn't even secure the lifeboat because it was banging around on the ship. So they hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship to hold it together because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis. They lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. The sea anchor is kind of like a brake almost. It's just kind of like a big, like a tarp behind it that was pulled to kind of slow it down. So the whole point was try and slow the ship down because they were being blown along and they didn't even know where they were going. And it was so bad that they had to actually pass ropes under the ship. That's actually called frapping the ship. Have you ever seen anything like that? And what's interesting is they actually wrap ropes around the ship to try to hold it together. That's how bad it was. It's basically they take a winch and tighten the ropes to hold the ship together is what they're doing. It's called frapping the ship. There is a picture of an older sail ship, and they had the ropes there and those knobs. That's what they would use for frapping. They would wrap it around the ship and pull it tight underneath to try to hold all the boat together so it doesn't come apart. Also in that sandbars of Syrtis is what they were afraid of. Archaeologists have studied that place, and they have found all kinds of ship remains. It's a very bad place to go. The areas between two land formations, it's known to fill up with sand and have these sand barges. And it's known as a graveyard of ships. And this kind of shows you where that area is at. So again, they were wanting to go along the coast. They now have been blown out of course, and they were actually headed for those sandbars, and they knew it. So they started trying to wrap the ship up because the sandbars, they knew if we hit that, we're likely gone because you're going to get stuck in those sandbars.
Calls it quicksand.
Yeah, calls it quicksand. And then he continues, says, we took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. Why are they throwing the cargo overboard? That's where his money's at.
Well, it makes it boat lighter.
Yeah, it makes it lighter. So think about it. So much for him. He was worried about losing money. I think the owner of this ship is why he pushed him. Now he's really losing money because he's throwing everything he's taken. Right, they're intentionally throwing it overboard. The reason behind that is because, as you mentioned, it's lightening the ship. The ship's sinking. So.
They don't want to die.
And they don't want to die. So suddenly the money didn't become as big of an issue as it was. So now they're actually throwing the cargo overboard. And then on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So that's all the tools and supplies and things like that. So they're throwing everything they can off this boat. That tells me the boat was probably taking on some water, and they were worried about it sinking. Plus, they're out there in these storms, and they're in a terrible predicament. And then to make it worse, it says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hopes of being saved. So it looks like it is a long storm that's for a long duration, and it's just raining and clouding. They can't see the stars. They can't see the sun. Why is it important for them to be able to see the stars and the sun? Right, that's how they navigated back then. They didn't have the GPSs and things that we have today. They actually navigated based on observing the sun and the stars and the coast and the landmarks, and that's how they navigated. So since they couldn't see the sun and they couldn't see the stars, imagine you're in the middle of the ocean. All you see is water all around you. They don't even know what direction they're going. They're just they don't know if it's day or night. They're just floating along. So where are they now? Well, you could say they were lost at sea. So, I mean, because basically that's all they would see they're just water, and they couldn't navigate. And not only that, they were driven by the wind, so they didn't even have the luxury of turning on the firing up the propeller or something and pushing them in a direction. They were just basically floating at the mercy of the sea, whatever direction the sea took them. And it says, after they'd gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. Again, Paul is not, he's one that says what he thinks. And he's telling them now. He's standing up. Remember, Paul's a prisoner. So here's the prisoner telling the captain and everyone else, you should have listened to what I said. I tried to warn you, but no, you didn't listen to me. And they had gone without food for a long time. Why do you think they were without food?
They ran out. They've been out.
Threw it overboard.
Yeah, they threw some of it overboard, and I'm sure they were rationing. They didn't know how long. So, I mean, what food they had, they were holding on to it in rations because they didn't have much food either. So they weren't eating on a regular basis because they were afraid they were going to starve to death out there. How do you think those on the ships felt on that time?
Terrified.
Yep, terrified. Oops, we've made a mistake. What can we do? Remember, who is Paul? What is Paul known for? Miracles. Exactly right. So who do you think they're going to start looking to now? They're going to start looking to God. And we see that so often in our world today. Whenever there's a crisis, people start wanting to look in God and let's pray. And you never hear the word pray until there's a crisis. Then after the crisis is over, you don't hear the word pray again. But in a crisis, mankind, I think it's because we have within us a natural desire that God put in us to follow Him. And down deep, everyone knows that there is a God. So in times of crisis, that's who we reach out to. So Paul is now getting ready to take over, as we look at this, command of this ship, which is really unusual. You wouldn't expect that to happen because he's a prisoner. But you're going to see that he actually is now going to take command of the ship. Because he says, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. And now he's going to talk about this miracle that God's getting ready to perform through him because he's there. He says, last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. So the angel of the Lord told Paul, if everybody stays with the boat, everybody puts their trust basically in me, I will take care of this. No one's going to lose their life, but you're going to lose your boat. So Paul is telling them now, keep up your courage. God spoke with me. I have faith in God. It's going to happen just as he said. Everybody's going to live. Everybody's going to make it. But we're going to have to lose the boat because we're going to run aground on some island. They don't know where they're at. Just some island. So on the 14th night, we're still being driven across the Adriatic Sea. So they're still helplessly being driven along. The other thing about it, who's in charge of the wind? God. So you find God is actually blowing them in the right direction. They don't know it because they're just totally lost. But they just have no idea where they're at. They just know they're in the Adriatic Sea. When about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. So there's the Adriatic Sea, which is circled. As you can see, they're originally being blown down. They're going to be blown down towards that land of lost ships, that sand barge area, and then the wind miraculously blew them back up in the right direction. But they're lost down there somewhere. They don't realize it, but they're really not that far off. They don't know where they're at, but God's the one that's steering them through the storm. And it mentions also that the sailors, since they were approaching land, how did the sailors sense they were approaching land, do you think? I would think these guys had lived on the sea. They'd been sailors, and they probably were able to watch the waves and the heights of the waves, and they might have heard water crashing somewhere, but whatever's going on, they sensed it. So they did something. If you think you're getting close to land, what would you want to check to see? If you're out in a deep sea and you think you're getting closer to land, what's the level of water going to do? It's going to get shallower.
Drop something.
Right. So that's exactly what they did. So it says they took soundings, and what soundings is, basically they got a lead anchor tied to a rope, and they drop that rope off the side, and every so many feet they've got a knot tied, and they let it go down till it hits the bottom, so then they can see how deep it is. So they took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. So that tells them it's getting shallower. So we're getting closer to land. And again, this is kind of shows you what they would use back then. And they would tie different knots and different things so you would know what each knot meant or each tie meant. But a fathom's roughly 6 feet. So they would drop that down, and they could tell by the knot or the string tied at that depth on that, or the string identifier tied on that string that's tied to the weight, how deep it is. So again, that tells them that they're getting close to land because it's getting shallower, which is good news to them, but it's also concerning. Why is it a concern that they're getting closer to land? Right, because they can't see. It's night. They can't see where they're going, but they do know that it's getting more shallow. And this likely caused panic because at midnight in the pitch black and high winds, you don't want to hit the shore because they know that they're rapidly moving into shallower water, because it says a short time later. So very quickly it's getting more shallow. So they know they're headed towards land. And then we read that in verse 29. That was exactly what their fear was. It says, fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. So you notice what they're doing now? They're praying. So they've listened to Paul, and now you're talking about Paul winning over some Christians. I wonder how many were baptized as soon as they got off that boat, because they put their faith in God, and now they're praying. They've dropped 4 anchors, so they're hoping that anchor holds them, because obviously if it doesn't, they're going to hit the rocks. So some of the sailors were obviously getting a little antsy. They know it was getting shallower. So what do you think their intention would be? What would you think the sailors would think about if I know we're getting ready to run ashore and it's getting shallower? Jump in lifeboats. Yeah.
Or something to blow with.
Exactly. So in an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. So what's happening now? Yeah. They were getting ready to jump ship. And why were they doing this in secret?
Because they didn't
Don't want everybody
want
to get
him.
in.
Yeah, there probably wasn't enough for everybody. But
It's probably similar to Titanic. It probably wasn't enough lifeboats for everybody. They know that Paul had said everybody needs to stay with the ship, but some of them didn't trust. Right, some of them did not trust Paul. Some of them did not put their faith in God. They had their faith in themselves, so they were just going to basically try and sneak out at night, and that's why they were doing it. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. Again, Paul knows what the Lord told him, and he told him everyone must stay with this ship. Now, there's a reason behind that, I think. I think God was wanting to test their faith in him. And he was wanting them to put their faith in God and not the ship or the... Right, and God wanted the sailors on this ship to put their trust that God would rescue them, not the lifeboat. Well, they were trying to get on the lifeboat. But Paul knew if these guys leave, if they get on this lifeboat, all bets are off then. I mean, it's anything's going to happen. I know if they stay on, God's going to save us and everyone's going to live. If they do not heed God's commands and get off the ship, then likely everybody's going to die. That's what he says. So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Wow, you're talking about something that would be hard to do. Imagine you're in a spot where you think you're going to sink, and now they cut the lifeboats. So the question is, who's in charge of the boat now? I kind of talked to who's in. Yeah, but who's commanding? Who told them to cut the ropes? Paul.
Paul is.
They are following Paul, and again, they're following Paul as Paul follows Christ. So God is ultimately in control, but they are now following Paul's order to the point they're willing to cut loose the lifeboats. So that shows you they've got great trust in Paul, which tells me I think Paul, they were praying together. I think the Spirit's touched some of their lives because they understand that God is behind all of this. Otherwise, they wouldn't have that confidence to just get rid of the lifeboats and let them sail away. And like I said, that's what's fascinating to me is Paul started out as a prisoner, which is the lowest of the low on the ship. Everybody, including the captain, the sailing master, and the Roman centurion, are now looking to Paul for leadership. So typically, he was the bottom of the totem pole. So it shows you, again, the power that God has, the power of him working through Paul, and they're now listening to him. So just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. Again, they had some food. They just didn't have much. They were rationing in it. He said, for the last 14 days, you've been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. The other thing to think about, too, is they all thought they were going to die. So imagine the stress, and I don't think they could eat or sleep or nothing. So Paul is now encouraging them to eat. He says, now I urge you to take some food because you need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. And look what he did. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. It doesn't say it here, but I wonder if there weren't some that were taking communion there. Because typically breaking of bread is linked with communion. But they're eating and they're breaking bread together. So I'm not so sure they didn't have a worship service there as they were getting ready to, as their sailing adventure was about to come to the end. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. So that tells you how big the ship was. That's a big ship. When they'd eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. What does that also demonstrate about the crew? They threw every bit of food they had in the water now. They trust in God. They put their trust where it needs to be. And how important is food? I mean, that's essential for life. So they're throwing their food overboard. And look what happened. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. So here it comes daylight, and guess what? They see land. So what do? Remember, they had 4 anchors dropped. So cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea. At the same time, untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresails to the wind and made for the beach. But remember what Paul said, we were going to lose the ship. And that's exactly what happened. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. Again, it showed you how rough the seas were still. So basically got stuck in the sand and just got beat to pieces, and it all broke apart. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. Why do you think they want to kill the prisoners? Right, because if the prisoners escape, they're going to be killed. So but guess who's one of the prisoners? Paul. So who would they have to kill? Paul. And that's the man that they've been trusting. That's the man that's led them to God. That's the man that they're following. And that's exactly what it says. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. Kind of surprised me, that verse. You would think everyone on a boat would know how to swim, especially during that time. But I guess during that time they didn't. But you would think back then they didn't have life jackets or anything. Right. So that's exactly what happened. You had some that could swim. And he says, if you can swim, jump overboard and swim to land. And then the rest who could not swim, they grabbed a hold of the piece of the boat that's floating around. And they floated on those.
Well, some of them, other ones were
Oh, that's true. I didn't think about it. There were some prisoners probably never been on a boat, so that's a good point.
Sailors would.
Yeah, the sailors, you would think the sailors would know how to swim, but regardless, so there's some on the ship that knew how to swim and some didn't. So Paul said, if you know how to swim, jump in and swim to shore. If you don't, jump in and grab a hold on a piece of wood or something and then float to shore. So the rest were to get there on planks or other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached the land safely. Isn't that amazing? I mean, God did exactly what he said he was going to do. He got them safe. And this is where they're at. They're at Malta. So they're almost to the coast of Sicily. So you can see they have no idea where they're at because they don't even know. They just know it's an island. But God slowly was pushing them in the right direction. And they ran ashore on this little island called Malta. And there's a picture of what Malta looks like, the island. Here's an actual picture of what it looks like today. I don't know if I could live in. They're just it's like you're on top of each other, aren't you? But that's Malta today. And what I find interesting, if you remember, they cut loose the anchors and they left them in the sea. And then I was wanting to. Yeah, I was going to show you. Yeah, that's what I was going to show you. That's exactly what it is. Here it is. They actually found anchors, ancient anchors and artifacts. They found 4 anchors right off the coast out there. I thought it was kind of neat. So we'll stop there. We're going to pick up in 28. I just wanted to show you that real quick. In Acts 28 on Sunday, and we'll finish that out. But again, it's you see God's hand in all of this. And I think it's fascinating. As I said, I showed you that off that coast, they actually found 4 ancient anchors right in that same area where Paul would have come on ground. So, again, only God could do that. So, anyway, with that said, Joe, do you want to close us in prayer?